So, we all know that to make beer, you first need a barley or rye or sometimes oat malt, which basically you roast it to bring out the sugars, and then you ferment it to bring out the alcohol. And hops both provide flavor and they preserve it. That's why IPAs, which are called India Pale Ales, typically have a lot of hop in them, because the long journey from England to India during the British rule, they wanted beer. For some reason, it wasn't so easy to brew beer in India, and to make the long journey, the hops helped preserve it. But of course, the primary flavor of beer, besides from the barley malt, is the hops. It makes a big difference. Hops, on the whole, are bitter. The more hops and the stronger the hops are, which means to say the more of the traditional chemicals they have in them, the more bitter the beer is. And indeed, bitterness is seen as one of the positive qualities a lot of people like, provided it's mixed in with a complex kind of flavor. The bitterness certainly adds something to it. Now, traditionally, certainly in Judaic texts, sweetness is defined as good and bitterness is defined as bad. As we know, Rishayo says that, that the evil make sweetness called bitter sweet and call darkness light. And in general, we speak about the bitterness of exile, the sweetness of the Torah, and so on. So to understand how this works at a deeper level, we first should, at a mystical level, we first should understand a little bit about the biology of sweetness and bitterness. Bitterness and sourness are often associated with either things that are poisonous. It's the plant's way of warning us that it's not good for you, and thereby so it doesn't get eaten. And also, fermented and decomposed stuff it often becomes bitter or sour. You get a bitter or sour taste in milk and chicken soup and so on as it begins to go off, and that's a warning that it's not good for us. So, in the first place, look at small children. They tend to recoil from bitterness and sourness. Bitterness and sourness, by the way, are both features in beer. The bitterness primarily from the hops, the sourness comes from various types of yeast. That's another important ingredient in the beer's flavor, is the yeast. So, now sweetness, on the other hand, we're programmed to like sweetness. The younger we are, the more sweetness we like. And this has to do because sweetness is easily accessible energy. There's glucose or something close to glucose there, whether it's fructose or sucrose and so on. And that means there's free energy. And since for most of human history we've not had enough food, so any available food that has lots of energy, especially for children who need to do a lot of growth, they need a lot of energy for that, and their brains are growing, and glucose is especially important for fueling the brain, and especially developing brain. So with all that, we're programmed to like and embrace sweetness. So sourness and bitterness indicates things that we're not likely to digest that well. And sweetness indicates things that, in essence, are very easy to digest and provide a lot of available energy. One of the great Kabbalistic principles is that the physical and spiritual represent a continuum. In other words, you begin with the infinite source of all. You have we talked before about Hechalot, there's a range of worlds through which the spiritual becomes progressively more limited, defined, and concrete, until you get to our physical world. But all the qualities that exist at the highest level, they also come down through a process of essentially devolution. They come down and become more concretized and more limited, but in this world, but they retain their connection to the ultimate source, because everything in the world has its life from the source of all life at every moment. And therefore, the Kabbalists say that the fundamental divine attribute of kindness, chesed, which is the sephirah, the spiritual attribute that relates to creation, in other words, it's the giving of life force, is ultimately related to the physical sweetness in an apple. And a little bit of understanding of the above-mentioned biology explains this. Chemistry, biochemistry explains this to us, because sweetness indicates energy. And energy is, of course, life to a physical body. And therefore, the physical manifestation of the spiritual quality of giving life, of chesed, of kindness, is sweetness, which indicates readily available energy. Gevura, severity, which is the divine attribute of limitation, of holding back, of concealment, of withdrawal, relates to bitterness. It indicates something which we ought to which we're distant from, which is hard to enjoy, which is hard to apprehend. However, we see that all these attributes are necessary, and indeed, one of the interesting things we see is that people come to appreciate bitterness and sourness when they know that it's not dangerous, and when it is one of a symphony of flavors. And this has actually, it serves as a very profound parable to one of the core experiences that I think most of us have, and we'll talk about that when we get to the next beer. The problem addressed is that we all know that any serious attempt at engaging the journey through Judaism involves struggle. It involves the disinclination to do what's right, the pain of being honest, the pain of controlling one's desires, where those desires get in the way of how we ought to behave between ourselves and our fellow human being, and ourselves and God. And the question, of course, that we ask, and this is taken from the Tanya written by the aforementioned Rabbi Shlomo Zalman of Liadi, which is a town in White Russia on the eastern edge of the Pale settlement, circa 1798. And he raises the question that someone might struggle mightily, might succeed, and yet the next morning you have the same struggles. So the question is, why would God create me that I can't reach the comfortable place of being a tzaddik, being someone who's completely conquered his or her negativity and reach a point of perfection? So he says, concerning this, the Eov said, now Eov never said this, but in the Talmud, in the first chapter of Bava Basra, they expand upon Eov's discussions, and they interpret some of the things that Eov said as Eov suggesting to God that just as God decreed his fate, God also decreed who would be righteous or who would be wicked. Job is basically complaining that there doesn't seem to be a lot of room for a person's choice. It seems everything is predestined. Now, when he says this, we don't, in this case, God does not reject Eov's assertion. So the Tanya says that this doesn't mean that God creates wicked people, God forbid, that you don't have free will, but that it's your destiny in life to share the temptations of the wicked and their thoughts and meditations alone, and they should eternally wage war to avert their minds from them, in order to subdue the sitra achara, literally the other side, in other words, the side of otherness, the side of evil. Yet they would not be able to annihilate it completely, for that's only accomplished by the totally righteous. So we explain that God has two types of gratification. Just like there are two kinds of pleasantness in the gastronomic realm, and indeed, as we'll see in a moment, this is a reference to where Jacob tells Esav, but in the end both Esav and Yaakov prepare for him, make for me delicacies. One is the complete annihilation of the other side and the conversion of bitter to sweet and darkness to light by the righteous. The second, when the other side is subdued while it's still at its strongest and most powerful. And to quote Ovadia, soars like an eagle where God brings her down through the efforts of the Dainonim, those people who always struggle, and the best they can hope for is that their thought, speech, and action be perfected. But they'll always be struggling with temptation. This is indicated in the verse that Jacob tells Esav, make me delicacies such as I love. The word matamim, delicacies, is in the plural to indicate two kinds of gratification. In the words of those of the Shekhinah to her children, the community of Israel. In other words, Jacob is really speaking prophetically here, as his words appear in the Torah, and he's speaking as if it were with the voice of God to the children of Israel. He says, look, make for me delicacies. The analogy is to material food. There are two kinds of relishes. One of sweet and luscious food, sweet stuff tastes good, and the other of tart or sour articles of food, which have been well spiced and garnished and made into delicacies to quicken the soul. And the concept meaning to say that if you take bitterness and you mix it in with other things, it actually makes a more complex and better tasting food than simply sweet food. So, sweet and sour, the bitterness of the hops and beer, and so on. The reason we learn as adults to appreciate them is because we reach a more sophisticated level of taste where we appreciate the interplay and the fact that things, the thrill as if it were, it's like a roller coaster, things that normally the body says, oh, they're poisonous, we mix them in and it becomes a good taste. But this is the idea that we take the bitterness, in other words, the negativity that we constantly confront, and we appreciate that the ability to resist it and transform it and incorporate it into doing the right thing, even though this constant struggle is something as if it were beloved of God, because in truth, the most profound embrace of light is where you actually have to deal with darkness, and in the midst of darkness, nevertheless find light. You can't get rid of the sour and bitter. Instead, you become a gourmand, and you take the sourness and bitterness, and you make something good out of it, which means to say that there's a value in the struggle itself, that there's a value to this idea that one finds God in those places where God most seems not to be. And that this, in essence, is in a way even more desirable and more perfect way of living as a Jew than being perfectly righteous. Because being perfectly righteous, once you're there, you're there. And on the other hand, the idea that I can constantly find God in the most unlikely places, and I constantly can extract good from amidst the most negative impulses, this is the true, as if it were a revelation of the idea that you really can find God everywhere, even in things that seem to resist God. And as a matter of fact, what emerges from this in truth is that the righteous don't exist for their own sake. In other words, the righteous exist solely to be able to stand above the fray and give direction and teaching to those who are in the midst of the battle. But the people who are constantly struggling and constantly forced to extract good from the propensity for evil and to take the shortcomings that we all come into this world with and acquire in our life and somehow use them in a positive way, this is the real essence of the challenge Judaism gives us, and this is expressed, and the parable for it is the capacity to find pleasure and good taste in the incorporation of bitterness and sourness and all those things into food. So I thought that beer is a particularly good metaphor for that, because all these tastes exist in great abundance, and nevertheless we thoroughly enjoy it. Indeed, one of the interesting aspects of this is that if one does not have wine to make Kiddush or Havdalah on, one can use something which is an accepted, well-respected drink. In other words, a common alcoholic beverage in that country. And one of the points that the that the halachists make about this, that in almost every country, some form of beer or another is the commonly drunk beverage. And I think that expresses the idea, wine can only be made in certain places and certain climates. Beer can be made everywhere. And so as if it were, wine represents sort of the easy path, but you can make something very enticing and very pleasurable and enjoyable out of something that's fundamentally sour and bitter and spoiled, which is what fermentation is. And this is the metaphor for the kind of lives that most of us as Jews have to live. And we should understand that this is not a source of frustration, but it should be a source of pride, that we can constantly dig out the holy and the godly and the kind and the good in a world which isn't, which is very much and very often the opposite. We can find it, we can transform it, and we can indeed take the adversity and enjoy it as something that we ought to ingest, that we ought to enjoy. Just as a somewhat humorous aside, one of the things you can make beer out of, but we don't have any tonight, you can make beer out of any carbohydrate, is buckwheat, is what we call in Yiddish kasha, which is a generic for cereal, but among Yiddish-speaking Jews of Russian extraction, that tends to be only buckwheat. So buckwheat is one of those, it's a flour actually, it's one of those things, it'll soon be at Passover, that there's a question as to whether it is forbidden by the rule that Ashkenazic Jews not eat non-grain types of legumes and seeds and so on. So this is a debate about buckwheat. So the question was, in light of that debate, would it be permitted at least to drink beer made from buckwheat on Passover because it's not the actual buckwheat itself? So there was one rabbi who wanted to forbid it. So one of the contemporary scholars wrote that it's inconceivable that we should forbid the beer made from buckwheat because, and remember, wine was not, people acquired enough wine for 4 cups of wine for each adult at the Seder with great difficulty. Wine was very, very hard to come by in Eastern Europe, especially at this period that we're talking about. Kosher wine anyways. So the writer says that it's inconceivable that we should forbid this drink for 8 days for the Jews on Passover because the travails of exile, living in the Pale of Settlement, the travails of exile are so great, let them at least drown their sorrows in the oblivion that comes from this beer, so you can't take it away from them. So thank God we're not in that situation, but it's interesting to note that as the common drink, that to bring a little bit of joy into their lives, that the choice seems to have been beer.